Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of this session of Cut the Crop. And today our guest is our senior cereal researcher, Jo Drummond. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah. So at ARIA, you gave a really good presentation on fungicide stewardship, and we got really good grower feedback. And so it made sense for us to turn it into a podcast.
Excellent.
So that's what we're going to talk about. And it's all about learning from the past to inform the future. And you set up this really nice wagon wheel, and you basically took, I guess, the listeners around the wagon wheel, showing them what the cultivars and the fungicide regimes were, through the decades. So why don't we just start with talking back in the 1970s? What were they doing? And take us on that journey.
Well, actually, I'll take you a step further back again. The idea of it was actually around how we as an industry and as growers and an industry have coped with change over the years. And over that time, we've seen cultivars change, and over that time, we've seen our practices change. So I thought it was a really good opportunity to put that in the ground for people to see, hey, we've coped with change before, and our parents and our grandparents coped with change, and our systems were resilient enough to withstand that, and we'll still be resilient as we go forwards.
Yeah, because it's not just fungicides, it's the combination of cultivars and fungicides and management practices.
Absolutely. And the disease landscape, if we think about what our sort of primary targets have been, so in the 1970s, we were really looking at leaf rust and we were looking at powdery mildew. So for part of this exercise, I went back into the archives and looked at, the diseases that we have today and where they've come from. So, Zymoseptoria tritici, so that's what causes Septoria tritici blotch, which is our big boy in wheat. That's been around since about 1927. So we've had about 100 years of dealing with it. And it only really became a problem in about the 1940s, but it wasn't considered to be of economic importance sufficiently to be able to warrant its own programs. So what we had in those times was we were relying pretty much on the seed treatment, so those organometallics. And by the time we got to the 1970s, those have been withdrawn. So we needed to have something in place to help our systems cope with those changes. Again, if we think about the cultivars, in the 1950s, there was much excitement that the new cultivar Hilgendorf was really tolerant to Septoria. And again, over time, those things change. So if we think about what happened in the 70s, we'd lost the organometallics and we were needing to think about approaches that were going to control our mildews and we're going to control our leaf rusts because cultivar selection was part of that. And what we saw then was the advent of our MBC chemistry. So that's our group 1 fungicides. That's things like where carbendazim sits now. So some of the things that we used back then will still be familiar, but how they're used has changed. So in those days, you might have done one foliar application and you might have done that at the first signs of disease, and that was going to be sufficient to get you through. And you'd be targeting a yield of about 3 to 4 tonnes per hectare.
Yeah, gosh, I won't say the good old days because the reality is 3 to 4 tonnes per hectare is not.
But at the time, that was where we were aiming.
Yeah.
And those approaches worked really well until we got to about 1980. So in 1980, we saw stripe rust for the first time. And between 1980 and 1982, it decimated all of our cultivars because mostly they were susceptible, having never had exposure before. And that changed the approaches that we took. So from the 1970s, where we were looking at a group 1, that just so happened that the first generation of triazoles, those group 3s, were available in that early 80s period. And that was a step change for us in terms of our ability to grow more and our ability to withstand those diseases. So, things like propiconazole were in use, things like trimenadol were in use. So there were some things that are currently still in use and there are some things that, perhaps have dropped off And also perchlorates was part of that first wave of triazoles. So some of those things are again familiar to us, but the way in which they were used was again, first signs of disease.
Yeah. So where did the mid-80s through to the mid-90s take us?
So that's when we're starting to see our second generation triazoles come through. Again, we've seen that shift from sort of rusts and mildews through to stripe rust. So there were big changes in our breeding programs because we understood the importance of our cultivar. And if we think of where we've come from in the 70s, where we're getting 3 to 4 tonnes, by the end of the 80s and into the 90s, we've sort of doubled that or more than doubled that, and we're sitting on about 9 tonnes. From the 90s onwards, we've started to see some more familiar products to us. So things like tebuconazole and epoxyconazole come to the market. And we're starting to get a little bit smarter around how we use them. So we're starting to see multiple timings. So it's not just, at the first signs of disease. We're starting to have, an application followed by another application with a window of about 28 days. And sometimes we're seeing a third application. And by the end of the 1990s, we're starting to put our packages together where we're starting to mix our mode of action groups. And there was a really interesting paper published in the 90s by Matthew Cromie and all of his crew that actually had some guidelines around fungicide stewardship. So this information's been around for 30 years and it's still reads pretty well. So it's things like, making cost-effective applications, using the appropriate dose rate, using the appropriate timings, not applying more than what you need, using appropriate technology. So all of those things that are still good management practice are pretty consistent through to this day.
So did the growers understand, do you think, back then, the risk that fungicide resistance was going to create for the industry as a whole?
Probably not. I mean, it wasn't really until sort of the late 1990s and early 2000s that, there were rumours and whispers of things happening overseas. And we'd been in the really privileged place of pretty much every decade having a new mode of action group come along that was really able to sort of be the next big step upwards. So we always had access to the next big thing, and it was really easy to do. And if we had cultivar tolerance in that mix, it was really easy just to get the new thing and integrate it into our programs and use it. So it really wasn't until sort of the 2000s that some of those things started to come out of the woodwork. And it really wasn't until the 2010s that it really hit home for us here in New Zealand. And that was when Zymoseptoria tritici, which had previously been a bit of a sleeping giant, reared its ugly head.
Yeah. So the golden years were really in those early 2000s where we didn't have the resistance problems and we were getting the big yield benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were armed with lots of new knowledge. So the 20 by 2020 program, we were looking at bringing our sowing dates forward. We were looking to increase the amount of light interception and then utilisation through into yield. So we had all of these great agronomic tools. But on the flip side, that was when the chemistry was starting to fall over. So by pulling our sowing dates really early, that increased our risk. And our programs had been triazole dominated with strobilurins, and we had that, that on-off with that strobilurin group, that group 11, that rendered that active ingredient or that mode of action group ineffective against Septoria tritici blotch pretty much overnight. And that meant that our programs were sort of changing as we evolved. And around that time, we saw group 7 chemistry come into mix. So again, that was another stepwise change. And we were looking at sort of layering up our leaves. So we've gone from our single application curative to perhaps 4 or more applications to try and layer up our leaves and protect our top 3 leaves.
And how well do you think at that time were the growers understanding around different mode of action groups and making sure that they were alternating or mixing or, to try and keep that resistance issue at bay?
Well, part of the problem is that we don't actually have that many mode of action groups that we're utilising. So for the last 40 years, triazoles group 3 have been the backbone of all of our programs. And that's pretty consistent both in New Zealand and overseas. We'd started to get to the point, that SDHIs came in with stipulations around their use and that they weren't to be applied as solo. So we were getting better at understanding how those mixtures needed to be to be effective and to protect chemistry, but it probably hasn't been until probably my time at FAR, and I've been at FAR since 2014, that those messages have become more consistent and have been picked up more and more by growers.
Yeah. So, okay, where are we then currently? What is the current situation and where do you think it's going to go?
Right, so currently, and we've been really lucky in that we've been supported by the A Lighter Touch program that's really helped us in that understanding Group 3 and Group 7 fungicide resistance. And we've also been supported by industry in this. So we've had companies providing some co-funding to help support us with this. So we've been doing sensitivity testing of our, the commonly used triazole and SDHI active ingredients, and we're looking at those changes in sensitivity over time. And I'll start with the triazoles because they're the most commonly used. So what we've seen, and it's no secret, is that, we are seeing a gradual erosion of sensitivity in that group. And we know that. We've known that for quite some time. And again, our practices have changed to accommodate the shifts in those types of programs. So, as far back as the, mid-2010s, we'd identified that things like prothioconazole had the legs on epoxyconazole for control of septoria, and our programs changed to accommodate that. We're in a place now where things have moved again, and it's really important for us collectively, if we want to continue to retain access to this group, that we use all of the tools that we've got. And that means we need to mix and match. So it means that we're using the 3 triazoles that we need to in our season, and we're using a different one at each timing. So we're alternating both within and between seasons, and we're making sure that we have mixtures. So we're not putting triazoles in by themselves. So we need to think about bringing in other mode of action groups, whether that be an SDHI where you need it because they also have stipulations around their use, or whether it's other mode of action groups, for example, our multi-site. So we've got Fulpit, which is a group M4. So its purpose is to try and protect the chemistry that it's mixed with. Or if we're in a place where we're very septoria specific, we can integrate things like group 21, fenpicoxamid, which is a newer active. Both fenpicoxamid and the Fulpit are still highly sensitive. So they are options that you can integrate. If we think about the SDHI space, we're not as further down the pathway as what we are with a triazole, but we are still seeing shifts. And you can see those shifts most readily where active ingredients have been on the market for longer. And what that means is, again, we have to mix and match. So while you are able to have 2 SDHIs in a season, and that's going to depend on the active that you use because some only allow you to use it once, you need to mix and match and alternate both within and between seasons. So if you're in a place where you're only using 1 SDHI in your season, use a different one next year. And if you are using 2 SDHIs in your season, use different ones at each timing, because what we're wanting to do is reduce the selection pressure on our actives. So what that means for you on the farm, or if you're an advisor and if you're in industry, it's really important to look at your crop and really think about the integrated things that you've got in place, like your cultivar and your cultural control practices, and what your disease spectrum is like on your farm. Because if you've got rust, you need to control the rust. If you've got septoria, you need to control the septoria. If you have a combination of both, that is where having a mixture is going to help you.
Yeah. So you talked about the industry and the companies, the commercial companies, sort of being part of this discussion. I mean, if you think in the past, you tended to just have companies in isolation going out and sort of, promoting their own products. But that's not going to work now. It's really got to be a collaborative sort of program of work.
Oh, absolutely.
Where the companies recognise that it is not in, it's in no one's best interest to push one product over another.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what we've collectively realised is that, no one company can eat all the pie. Everybody has to share the pie because our active ingredients are precious to us. And they're precious because A, they take a really long time to come to the market. B, they cost an inordinate amount of money to bring to the market. And C, we actually have to make sure that we continue to use them, because unlike in the past, there is no new mode of action group that's going to come and be the stepwise change that we've been used to. So what we've got is what we've got. And that needs to be sort of taken into account when we think about our program as a whole. So what we're trying to do at FAR is we're trying to, help you so that you can retain access to those products, and also come up with strategies that can help you reduce your reliance on some of these things so that you can use your big guns when you need to use your big guns.
And the way in which to do that is to be looking at the cultivars and what tolerance they may have to some of the diseases, and then also to look at, for example, some of the biological products.
Yep, absolutely. But before we even do that, we actually need to look at the specific pressures that we're facing on our own farms. And that's going to be really important to help us decide what type of approach to take, because that's going to vary from season to season. So your balanced program in one year might look quite different to what happens in another. And that's why the research that we're doing at FAR is going to help us across all of those different scenarios, because we know that some years you're going to get smacked with everything and your program's going to look quite different. And other years, you may not have the same level of disease pressure, and you need to ask yourself, is it appropriate to just have the same blanket approach for everything, knowing that if you go too hard, you may actually cut yourself off in the years to come. So some of the work that we're looking at is, looking at our effective use of genetics, and that's looking at the cultivars themselves and finding appropriate strategies for them, looking at cultivars and mixtures that's going to help us, create multiple gene, mode of action group obstacle courses for things to overcome, and then looking at where we can integrate biologicals that might help us alleviate pressure on that chemistry and help us have more balanced programs. So when the time comes that things do start to slip or slide, we've actually got the system in place that's ready to go. And it's a slow process. And the idea is it's like baby steps so that it doesn't hurt quite so much when you have to rip the Band-Aid off.
Yeah. But it also is a much more complex situation
absolutely.
than it was back in the 70s, where you had, one particular problem and you had a chemical that solved that problem.
And I don't think that that's not how we live anymore. We've got multiple problems that have multiple different solutions that are quite multifaceted. And that's really hard because we're all time poor and we want easy solutions. But what it means is that, we just have to, get in the crop, walk the crop, feel the crop and see what's happening, because that's the only way for us to develop a program that's going to be effective and appropriate for us in any given season on any given farm.
Yeah. But it's a harder story to sell.
Oh, definitely.
Because, there is no silver bullet coming along. There is not another fungicide that will just do whatever. It's all about using what you've got in the most sensible, careful, considered way, and dialing in some other options that are not silver bullets either.
No, and it is messy and it is challenging, but I think going back over this sort of 50 years of crop protection, we have coped with change before. We will cope with change again. And there is a surprising amount of resilience in our systems. We just have to back ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are fortunate in the sense that we have learnt from what's happened in other countries, where they've experienced the resistance problems way ahead of us, but they've not necessarily had the time to be able to develop some of these slightly more complex, sophisticated programs.
Oh, absolutely. And we can learn a lot from what happens in other countries, and we can be ahead of the game because things will change. It's just a matter of, having that system and readiness ready for when that happens. And it might not be in 2 years, it might not be in 5 years, but I've been at FAR for 9 years and already that system has changed a lot, and we can expect to see change again.
Okay, so let's just sort of wrap up then with your sort of top 3 key messages.
Top 3 key messages is understand your cultivar and the system that you're operating in, because that's going to dictate the approach that you take in a given season. Number 2, protect your triazole backbone by mixing, matching and alternating within and between seasons. Likewise for your SDHIs, mix, match and alternate between seasons. You need to do that because the life of your fungicides depend upon it.
Yes. And your farm business
ultimately
depends
your farm business is going to depend upon your ability to mix and match and steward your chemistry so that you can use it when you really need it.
Yeah. And I think that the wagon wheel demonstration that you gave at ARIA was a really nice way to illustrate those key points. And we should do something similar again next year.
No pressure.
Okay, thank you very much, Jo. As always, a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. And thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.